welcome everybody to Riga Digital Forum, the first new technology short film festival in the Baltics. The closest one was, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around Amsterdam. So this is a pretty large step. Welcome everybody who's online, and welcome everybody who's offline. So this is the very first year we're having this festival, and it's, I must say it's quite grandiose. I mean, like, we had like more than 1,300 submissions online from several countries. I'll tell you about that more. But right before we get to that, I would like to invite the rector of the RISEBA University, Irina Senyikova, to say a couple of quite celebratory words.
Thank you. On behalf of RISEBA University of Business, Arts and Technology, and I really would like to emphasize the word technology, I would like to greet you for the first Riga Digital Forum. It was said that I'm greeting also people who are online and who are offline. And do not get surprised that you are not many offline, as our online auditorium is much, much larger. But the trick is that nowadays, the border between online and offline is really, really blurred. Sometimes we cannot really distinguish which reality we are living in, and where is a real reality and where is virtual reality. In fact, first thing which I saw entering, the guy with the virtual reality glasses. This is life we're living in. I think I was in the pre-opening, I was telling that many things which years before we only read in books, in science fiction books, already became a reality. I also have to say that also this is the first digital forum, and when launching the forum, we didn't know what the response is going to be. It happened, the response is really tremendous, and for the short film competition, we've got 1,384 submissions from 81 countries. Imagine the amount of work the jury has done. And I seriously, really just, we have to greet it. We think that we start with small, but again, thanks to technologies, we start really big. I would like to wish you really interesting 2 days. Be able to see the films which have been submitted for the competition, enjoy new technologies, think how these technologies can be applied in different spheres of activity. Also learn something new and put the borders even further. Enjoy the festival, and I will also officially like to greet our sponsors and the partner who we are cooperating. It is Telia Latvija, and also who will have a chance to get the prize tomorrow. So enjoy the festivals. And now I would like to officially announce Riga Digital Forum open. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Professor Irina Senyikova. And I'll just adjust the microphone nonchalantly and professionally. Hello and welcome, everybody. So, yeah, I'd like to, there's a lot of things that are going into the technologies. You know, it's not just about the way you use technologies, but, or rather, it's not just about using the technology, it's about the way you use it. So a lot of it goes into the thing that I have on my presentation. So, is it on? Just 1 second, some technical difficulty. Awesome. So the cutting edge of film technology, you know, there is a lot of things, people usually, I come from a technology background myself, and I have this feeling that when people talk about technology, there is this sharp distinction between arts and tech. You might have noticed it. I prefer that, you know, I have the feeling myself that I sometimes am more on the tech side than the art side. Maybe you're on the other. But nonetheless, it does bring people closer together. It allows more people to do more impressive things and more easily. Tech becomes more, you know, usable. But the RIGA Digital Forum, as I'm legally obliged to say to you about 70 more times during this event. So it's a new technology film festival. It's the first one around here in the Baltics, and it's the first RIGA Digital Forum ever. And of course, it's as I said, for artists and geeks. So there are three categories. We had, a short film. We had a short film contest in three categories. So the first one is drone. Didn't want to mess that up. There's a lot that goes into these little flying mavericks. It's quite, people used to, short time ago, they needed to be engineers basically to use one, let alone own one. And the first ones appeared in the 2000s. I'll tell you more about that. 360 and VR. There's also you know the feeling. There's a new media, it's all exciting, but there's a lot of things you can do wrong with it. And this festival is sort of aimed at trying to understand what you can do with it and what you probably shouldn't do with it. And of course, there's open space, because film technology, as I said, there's a lot of things that go into it, beginning with, for example, machine learning that you'll probably see in some larger companies, to such things as, for example, motion capture, which we had, one of these workshops for. But yeah, more about drones. So the bigger issues concerning drones are, sort of dealing with autonomy. Because if you have to tell, how many of you have ever programmed? Raise your hands. Okay, so it's a few people. Do you know this really frustrating feeling when you're trying to tell your computer to do something, and you spend about six hours trying to understand where you didn't put the semicolon. So the same thing goes for drones. A lot of the new tech is oriented at trying to make it more usable, more easily to use, and much more smoother. The same thing goes for tech specs, bigger and better, and faster. And of course, you can't forget about Moore's Law in this situation. When you talk about drones, Moore's Law, it was founded in I believe the 60s. So it's every 18 months, a processor becomes twice as cheap and twice as powerful. I think the same thing applies for drones. I'll give you a few examples. So this is an example of how automation is learned. So this is an MIT experiment. It's you might have actually seen one of these drones, might have actually used them before, this sort of technology, when you're trying to, you give the frame to the program, and then it figures out how to film it on its own. And not only that, it's not only difficult to program your drone, to keep it level, it's also super mega difficult to tell your drone to actually follow the other person. Whether it's this exact piece of research is more concerned with trying to make exact frames and with changing subjects. So, for example, if you're trying to, as it'll later on show, if you try to run at it with an axe or just trying to configure it, depends on your alignment. You are probably going to have quite the difficulty getting it in your hands. So this is basically a prototype. When it goes further, DJI. When it goes further on, it goes so far as to, for example, you would have a drone. DJI have actually released these exact kinds of drones, but it's not showing at the exact spot I wanted to. So basically, on its own, avoids mountains. On its own, it avoids, for example, crash landing, or, for example, follows people around. And you have no idea how much programming goes into those. And furthermore, it takes actually quite a lot of tech knowledge to actually mount a camera onto the drone. And it's an insane amount of work for something a lot of people actually consider to be, very self-explanatory. Smooth. And drone automation goes even as far as, like launching one drone is, quite a lot. It's launching like 20 drones on a synchronized show. And this is one of the things that actually Latvians have done. One of the speakers at this event, at the very end of the festival, SPH Engineering, Kristaps Bras, he'll be talking about how exactly these synchronized drone shows work. Because I mentioned before, you needed to be an engineer in master's, you needed to have a master's degree in engineering to control a drone. Well, you actually need to have a master's degree in engineering to do this sort of thing. And people usually talk about how this sort of stuff happens abroad. But yeah, turns out one of the bigger competitors for this market is right here in Latvia, in Ullēn, in fact, I believe. So as time goes on, it becomes easier. You can do much more. You can do much more with them, and there is you found potential in many fields. And not only is this lent to basically drones becoming much smarter, it also becomes is lent to drones becoming much more powerful. A case in point, you remember I mentioned SPH Engineering. The same guys, they did the first base jump from a drone. And did you know that this exact drone was used earlier this year to find basically an airplane wreck, a World War II airplane wreck near, it was near Greenland. So the technology, the one that locals offer and in general, is actually there, and it's pretty damn impressive. So they can not only, these ones, by the way, are also used by firefighters. So they're not only supposed to lift people, but yeah, like hundreds of kilograms worth of, pipe. And this sort of evolution of technology, evolution of drone strength, actually leads to much more. You talk about adding a small webcam to a drone. It's not a big feat, but adding an entire basically a camera set to this flying thingamajigger, this small helicopter, that is quite the feat. And that is something we are only right now beginning to do. This is only this is something really state of the art. As I said, right here in Latvia. VR too. VR has this very, very strange position when it comes to like its uses, because there's 360 video. Maybe most of you have seen it. It's sort of like this big canvas. How many of you have actually used VR? Okay, this is considerably more people than they have programmed. This is nice. By the way, if you want to try VR, we'll have film demos and we'll have game demos by Portals, but more on that also later. So yeah, there is this big debate on how exactly storytelling works when it comes to virtual reality, because it's not exactly like a film. It's not exactly, or most games, one might argue. And this is what we're going to argue about in about an hour and a half at the panel discussion with game developers, VR developers, and filmmakers, and also physicians. We are going to try to understand what exactly is the boundary, because when it comes to new media, you probably you know the story about the first cinema display where there was a train running towards the camera, and the auditorium ran out of the cinema because they were afraid they were going to get wrecked by the train. Or I actually remember my parents talking about, there was this old game, Doom 2, I believe, and they told that the graphics were so amazingly realistic. This is the closest we're going to get to life. And, it's, it's gone quite a long way. And this is the sort of, so VR is also in its baby steps. But it's still used for many, many applications. For example, in medicine, it's used for therapy. Did you know that we have one of the speakers at the panel discussion is going to be Marina Petrakova. She's one of the founders of a startup that is working on trying to rehabilitate children with autism, and the results are actually quite staggering. If it's true what she says, and research is correct, so it might actually take. Ordinary therapy takes about 3 years. If the application works well, it's actually going to minimize to about 6 months. And that is quite a lot. I've actually met people who have self-treated phobias with virtual reality by making the set experiences. And yeah, it goes a really a long way. And you know, maybe it's much less costly than going to a therapist. Cool. Will this work? Not as intended. Okay. So basically, this was a demonstration from Anatomy Next. So they offered this virtual reality experience to train people in, well, anatomy. They have offered it to universities in America. They offer it to universities in Latvia as well. So it's actually much cheaper, much more effective, and really much more healthy if we cut up people in virtual reality than try to wait for doctors to have the experience to cut up them in real life. So it's extremely, you know, it can save quite a lot of money for the taxpayer and perhaps for someone trying to, you know, get some healthcare. Same thing goes for education. There's a lot of research going on in virtual reality that it is completely different from the other media because of its immersion effect. So it can offer, it offers much more learning scaffolding, which is the effect of learning how, not learning that. The effect that you go from the abstract to the practical, and you actually know how to use it. And it also gives great opportunities for like inclusion. For example, this one, and this is going to be one of the topics that is going to be covered also later today, right after me, about basically empathy in VR. Like, for example, if I put on a headset on you and tell you that, for example, you know, you're going to see an ancient ritual, are you really going to understand that? So they are going to expand much more on trying how to actually make it effective, and yeah, how to make it effective and not make it sort of like you're the bystander as one of the people sort of there but not exactly there. So this is Google Expeditions. What they offer is basically educational packages. You can like order it with Google Cardboard, which costs about $20 a piece. You can just insert your phone. So don't tell me that you can't afford VR. Yeah, you can go on any adventure. It basically offers you a series of different curricula, and it can be a very useful tool, for example, in teaching. And last but not least, we can't forget about VR and entertainment, though it's actually coming here quite slowly. YouTube integrated 360 video in 2014, and I think, or it was 2015, and Facebook did it in 2017, and that's actually quite slow, considering that you know how actually available VR is. But the industry, it seems like it might be growing. Like according to some data, the worldwide amount spent is 6.2 billion on the consumer market, you know, for personal use, and about 1 billion for marketing. So everybody actually interested in making content, you know, there's about 1 billion for you to try to claim your place in. And according to some other data, IDC, for example, they project that every year it's going to double. But there might be some technical problems. For example, one of them, well, it's actually quite difficult to make content, 3D content, on a world that consists of 2D screens. It's also, as I said, about the experimental part. VR is so new, we don't really know what to do with it and what not. And if you use VR anytime soon, you're probably going to get nauseous, but don't worry, I guess it's part of the learning experience. But a big question, and a lot of the conversations about VR are going to be not that it is here to stay, and not that you should grab it, and try using it immediately. But they are questioning whether or not it's actually here to stay, because not only computer gamers, filmmakers, they are sort of iffy about virtual reality. It's also it's so not exactly here. It's so affordable, but people know it's so little that you really need to be taught how to market it. And of course, the everyday, or rather the open category, the more broader spectrum of things. And this one I really enjoy because this is where the machine learning things come into mind. So as technology is becoming much more powerful, and for example, a prime example is that there are many movies that have actually been taken with home appliances. For example, an iPhone. Searching for Sugar Man. I'm not sure how famous it is for the feat that it actually won an Academy Award for the Best Documentary Feature at the 85th Academy Awards, and it was partially shot on an iPhone. So yeah, I mean, like, we have everything we need to make a cool movie right here and right now. We don't need to invest or wait. Or rather, we don't even, might not even need the extra infrastructure. The errors are also easier to fix. That, for example, coming from a musical background, you know how digital recording and the like tape recording changed, and you can like press 3 buttons, add a sound effect, and suddenly you go from this tinny thing that sounds like somebody's using a fork to annoy the neighbors by hitting the radiators to actually a pretty decent mix. And of course, this all means if you're actually creative enough and you approach it creatively enough, you can make a really, really great, really explosive product for just a couple of hundred. Well, a couple of hundred and some invested time, but still, everything is a skill, isn't it? And probably most of you have actually seen this sort of meme status video. So this is from the Avengers, and this is what it looks like without CGI. It's a bit awkward, isn't it? So actually, we are not only sort of we don't have these technologies at our disposal anymore. These technologies are basically part of our viewing experience. We can't live without them. The stories aren't coherent anymore. And I believe, and the technologies is also really going further on. You know how about drones? They move on their own, and you don't have to control them as accurately anymore. So you might not actually need to do that much editing in the near future. Well, you probably will. This is a very bold statement. But some of the editing could be taken away by a few plugins. So for example, for sound, it's SonarWorks that actually adjusts your headphones and and allows the sound to be much more easily manipulated, which is one of the talks we'll be having tomorrow by Maris Deus. He'll be talking about virtual reality and sound. But the same thing applies to pictures. It applies to videos. There are actually machine learning algorithms that can not only, for example, complete these sorts of pictures. It looks sort of easy. You could figure out what's going to happen. But there are also, I've seen actual machine algorithms that you show a small video clip to, and it can complete the action. So for example, if you're having somebody, throw this thing into the sky, the machine learning algorithm is going to figure out what it's going to look like when it's falling. Okay, I was just hoping he would be balding. But yeah, when it comes to all these technologies, all these new things you can do, all these crazy new opportunities, there are also a lot more things we don't really understand. Dostoevsky used to talk about progress. You know, there is not this kind of linear progress that we're going upwards. You could always think of it, you know, as the Zeno's paradox, that if this is the whole, this is the, you know, the ultimate progress. We're always going to take a half a step, and a half a step from that, and a half a step from that. And the worst part is, for example, nowadays, the steps are really incremental. If we, you know, zoom in and check, for example, if we zoom in and check how large the steps are, they're always going to look the same for us as it did for the people that lived 4,000 years ago when films weren't even a word, or or what it's going to look like 2,000 years from now. And another thing is that tech is really becoming ubiquitous. So you can't really, how many of you don't have a smartphone or a phone at all? Yeah, okay. So more people, actually less people don't have a smartphone than have used VR or programmed. But yeah, as I said, it lends new opportunities, it lends new things and with new opportunities, there are more things we don't understand. And the biggest question is what the hell do we do with it? Like, we have all this stuff, and it, you know, people, when they talk about technology, there's this overarching feeling that it's going to fix things, that there is going to be this, I don't know, new crazy drone that's going to follow you around without any instructions, and that you're going to make extremely great movies. Or, for example, that there are going to be these extremely awesome recording, you know, microphones, for example, that you'll be. I've seen at MIT there are actually speakers that work like spotlights. They can aim for your head, and only you'll be able to hear the thing from the speaker. But really, it's not going to fix anything. There's still going to be this large half step that I mentioned about Dostoevsky. There's always going to be more and more challenges, and we're probably going to see the shadow part of it. Or rather, we're just going to try to make a film, and it's going to be a really hard learning process. But all in all, oh no. I had this very inspirational one-liner, but okay. I guess as I said before, it's not so much about how you use the technology. Yeah, it's not so much about the technology itself. If you're going to, for example, sell somebody a VR application or film some kind of demo with a drone, that's not really the selling point. The real story, the real juice is behind everything, like the way you use it. And this is what part of what RIGA Digital Forum is all about. It's all about trying to understand, tie together, and really understand where we can put the technology, and if you have any crazy ideas, how you can use the technology to lend yourself a hand. Thanks. So yeah, as I didn't mention before, I'm going to be the host for tonight and tomorrow. My name is Kaspars, and I'm one of the people creating this project, this festival, and I'm also one of the people very involved in virtual reality. You might have noticed that I talked about VR much more avidly than I did about the rest of the technologies. But yeah, so right now, there's going to be a little bit of free time. I'm just going to spend a couple of seconds trying to find my phone to understand how much free time we're going to have. And so we're going to have about 15 minutes of free time once I'm done with like the housekeeping. So, oh. No, it wasn't there. Okay, just a sec. So we're going to have 14 minutes by this point. Thanks. So the agenda for today. we're going to have 3 events. So the first one is going to be these 2 lovely Othvrs. They are going to talk about, I mentioned before, about empathy, about how to make content in VR as not to be imposing, as not to be this sort of weird, awkward bystander. By the way, this lecture is like a straight continuation from the event at Riga International Film Festival, who are we're helping out with whom we are helping out, and they're helping out us, you know. But yeah, this is going to be a really interesting talk for everybody, especially if you have been at Riga International Film Festival, the event today. Then this is going to be super interesting for you, and it's also going to be ultra interesting for everybody else who hasn't been there. New narratives with new tech, but with the same picture. So the next event is going to take place at 6. We're going to have a talk about why VR, or rather, not exactly even why VR. What can we do with VR, and how does it differ from filmmaking? How does it differ for gaming? Because there is this, you know, sort of weird, awkward, like this intermingling position, and we're probably going to have a heated discussion because half of the members over here are really against VR, and half of the members are totally tooth and claw for VR. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a bloodshed, and it's going to be really, really, really fun. Last but not least, so there are a few things that are happening all day. There were about 2/3 of the audience didn't raise their hands when I asked whether or not you've used VR. So there are two ways you can experience VR for the first time. So the first option is to go to the little hall. There is portals, and they're offering game demos. So if you want to try out, you know, some sort of game with them, or see what VR really feels like, go talk to them. They'll be totally open, and they'll be extremely helpful. Also, I mentioned the film contest. So we have 2 VR stations, 2 Oculi Go. You can walk up to Aigars, the guy who is in charge of the Oculi, and ask him to see the results, or what the jury found to be the 9 best VR or 360 video films. Last but not least, there is an AR exhibition. You might have noticed the strange discs at the this hallway. So if you look at the plaques, you're going to find out that you can download an app and make more out of this exhibition. Sorry, I forgot the word. Yeah, you can make more out of the exhibition. Find out what Latvia looked like 2,000 years ago. Find out what Latvia looked like 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years from now in the future. You should totally check it. It's by Zana Zelman. She's awesome. And of course, I can't forget. You should really, if you want some refreshments, the cafe is open. Grab a coffee and come back. So have a chat with everybody. Stick around. Let's have a coffee and video. Okay. Yeah, let's have a coffee. But in the interludes, we'll be having demos of the open category finalists. So if you don't want to get the coffee, you don't want to go for a walk, you can see another part of the jury's work. So we're going throughout the day, show you like in batches of 1 to about 3, the different finalists for the open category. So thanks, and see you at Tessa and Fee's lecture. Hello. Oh, yeah, spectacular. Hey guys, thanks for everybody sticking around. Those of you who are offline and those of you who are online as well. So you just experienced a couple of open category films. I really hope you enjoyed them, like we did, the jury did. They're actually, some of them are extremely creative. And as I said, I think it's a Latvian thing, but if it comes from Latvia, it has a special place in our hearts. But yeah, right now, so right at this very moment, we have two wonderful speakers I mentioned. I sort of alluded to them before. We have the Othvrs. I mentioned before the feeling, you know, like you come to a party and you're not really a part of the party. You're just sitting there and watching strangely. You're sort of there, but you're not really there. So that's most of the topics that they will be focusing on today in the presentation. Superb. Give it up for the Othvrs.
Thank you, Kaspars.
Hello.
And for inviting us. This is a really fun-looking festival. We're very happy to be here.
You go first.
Okay. So we're just going to introduce ourselves, and also, FYI, we've been calling ourselves the Othvrs because I suppose in English that kind of makes kind of phonetical sense. Othvrs. Cool. So nice to meet you. I'm Fee. So I've only been in the industry for about a year and a half. I got into VR by graduating a filmmaking and creative media course about a year and a half ago. And basically I went to a talk a bit like this, and it was on kind of there's not enough content being created for VR. It was kind of, that was looking at what was being made maybe about 2 years ago. So it was a lot of commercials and basically things that were being made but with not much thought put into it, just because it's like gimmicky and new and a fad. And yeah, the feeling I got when I left was like, oh, this medium has so much potential. There could be really nice things made, and there's like a massive gap in the industry. And I reckoned I would be up for making content for it. So in my final year, I was the only student of like 70-ish on my course who decided to make a virtual reality film, and I made it, and then sent it to some 360 production companies, and luckily one bit, and I ended up doing an internship in London with Surround Vision for half a year, and now I can say, you know, I've got a credit on a series by Google VR, and also I've been on a lot of Sky VR shoots. So somehow I've become a professional in a very small amount of time.
And I'm Tessa. I come from an art and installation art and documentary background, but I got into VR also about 2 years ago, and since then I've been curating VR for festivals, Sheffield Doc Fest in the UK and Open City Doc Fest in London. I also am a creative producer for virtual reality, so I've made work that's shown internationally, and with director Jane Gauntlet, if that name rings a bell, might do. And I am also a PhD researcher in documentary and virtual reality. We'll tell you a bit about this in the next slide, but together we created a collaborative of young filmmakers in Bristol who are interested in making VR and 360, and we decided to make a kind of inclusive and nurturing space for like new makers to get into VR and 360 that feels very accessible and doesn't feel exclusive. And today we're going to be talking about making with meaning and the concept of empathy inside VR, because it's something that's talked about a lot, but it's often something that people don't think about possibly critically enough. So it's one of the things that we talk about really early on in our workshops, is how to start thinking critically about VR and how to start critiquing what you're seeing, perhaps.
So just to give a bit of context, this opening slide is a kind of relevant to this talk because it's a shot from, I went on a day out to a protest and just had a camera with me. I happened to be doing something on that day. So I filmed a song outside of a courthouse that was being protested outside of. And I thought, oh, that's such a nice moment. And I've obviously got the footage. And I thought it'd make a kind of a nice, slightly relevant image. But the way that it's really relevant to this talk is that on its own looks nice and sounds nice, but it isn't actually particularly relevant to anything. So the having a shot of a protest doesn't mean anything. I can't specifically, unless I gave the footage to the group and they maybe posted it on their social media to kind of spread awareness that they're doing it. It still just kind of makes it like a gimmicky, kind of shareable item. It's not necessarily doing anything to actually help the cause. It could maybe be edited in like a string of inspirational, similar things like that and make a film. But in general, just having a shot on its own, kind of, it's like, oh, that looks nice, or you could watch it, that's interesting, and then you take it off and go. That feeling is what we're going to be talking about, trying to avoid and not do today.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit more about us, the others, and the collaborative group that we have. We're particularly aimed at kind of increasing underrepresented groups to pick up VR, because I think we touched on it briefly earlier, that it's quite a techie field, and maybe what we want to encourage is more people from different backgrounds, artistically, but also personally, because it's so important that a collective range of backgrounds can make the most impactful work. And probably if it's a lot of people that are very much into the technology and not the storytelling, then it's not going to be as good a medium as it can be.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, our workshops are all about being very DIY, hands-on, just kind of dispelling myths that anything is too technical or you need a big crew or lots of money. We're all about just like make stuff, watch stuff. Now you're in the industry. It's that easy. You guys are probably, having made 360 films, probably as qualified as us even.
And also that rules are made to be broken. So we set up all these rules in here, but actually it could be quite likely that you break all of them and still make something amazing. So yeah, we already kind of covered that, what this talk is going to be going over. There's a lot of discussion that that VR can really generate empathy because you see people's lives, you live through their experience, but it's obviously very important to be critical of that feeling. I think we'll go straight. So the good things about VR are
that it's new, it's experiential, and it's honest or real. So
examples of that would be something like this: neurospeculative Afrofeminism. Which is it's part neuroscience, part design technology, and part VR experience. It was made by a group of women of colour that decided there wasn't enough representation, that they were seeing positive representation of women of colour existing in these hyper-technical spaces. So they kind of made this version of the future that you can step into. It's like through the guise of entering into a hair salon and going through that particularly cultural ritual of hair, but also discussing ideas of what the future might look like in terms of technology that is suited to women of colour, that sunblock for travelling into dimensions, and earrings that are cameras that give you visibility and affirmation. And one of the things that we're trying to get across is that VR is so new and so all-encompassing. You make these worlds, and you can take me to the top of a mountain, that's really amazing, but you can also take me somewhere where I literally can't be. You can give me a vision of the future that could change how I start to live in the world, and in fact, through that, bring that future about. So that's one of the most amazing things that VR can do.
So experiential, obviously, we all know VR is specifically different than other medium for being more immersive and it's something that happens to you. You don't watch it, you would refer to it as like, I did this, a bit like games or something. But essentially, it's a next level beyond filmmaking, and yeah, you feel it, you can have an experience that you wouldn't otherwise have. This example is Notes on Blindness. You guys might have seen the film or this experience, they're both very famous. And it's kind of gives you an eye into the story of someone who loses their sight, and it kind of replicates what that kind of looks like visually. So you can kind of see on the screen, it's that's like the sound of raindrops hitting an umbrella. It's a really nice experience, but again, this is something that can only really be done in VR because you're inside of it, and you're not specifically, you don't see your body, but you're hearing the narrative of the story, and it takes you somewhere that you couldn't do if it was a film.
And real, but one of the most amazing things about VR is that you feel like you're really there, that you've really met these people, and that you have a real window into their stories that they're telling you. And this particular example is Notes to My Father, which is a film by Jayesh Patel, which is a really beautiful, subtle documentary. Obviously, because there is this element of reality, virtual reality really suits the documentary format. So this is a documentary about this girl in India who was sold into the sex trade by her father, but this is a film about her coming back to her father and having reparatory meetings with him. And it's very subtle, very beautiful, and it really shows you what her world is like. Especially in this instance, it's not about how horrible her life was when she was being sex trafficked, but it's more about what her life is now, what her actual environments are like. And also, it's the most amazing thing it does is it breaks you out of your own perspective. So you suddenly realize, you aren't in this space, and what it means to be someone who visits this space without your body, kind of thing. And there's a particularly amazing scene where you're on a train, and it's just shots of the camera inside the train, and the train is full of men, and they're all looking at the camera because the camera is something new to them. But what the effect that this has when you're in a headset is that everybody is looking at you, everyone is staring at you, and without anything bad happening particularly, you see what it might feel like to be an object or be so out of place on that train, and it's a really wonderful scene.
Yeah, and it gets great reactions, like if you watch it, of course you'd have the same, but from people who would have never had that perspective, e.g. mostly male participants.
And the bad things about VR, you might be surprised to find out, are exactly the same things, that it's new, experiential, and this reality honest.
Yeah. So you may have seen this, it's, what's it called again? Evolution of Verse by Chris Milk. Chris Milk is kind of revealed.
He's called like the granddaddy of VR, so it's okay to critique his work now, I think.
So this is a piece that was made in 2015, which is kind of also referred to as like the very beginning of the new influx of VR. So this film was made to make the viewer say, wow, watch something fantastic. It's got what Kaspars referred to earlier, the Great Train Robbery. It has a homage to that, where you have a train come towards you and it almost hits you and then bursts into birds, and then you...
It's kind of every gimmick that you can imagine, everything that you could... like.
You get held by a baby.
So it's like, because it's so new, people think, wow, wouldn't that look cool? And mash them all into one film, which might not work.
Like we say, it's new, it looks good, it can make you be amazed, but does it mean anything? Is it doing anything? This is the kind of film that makes people think VR is like a passing trend. It's just like, it's to look at and go, oh, okay, after you've seen it for the second time.
Yeah. Similarly, experiential, the fact that everything happens, the fact that everything happens to you, unless you're very subtle about what you're doing, you can make people feel quite ill. You can make people feel like a ghost in the room, which we were talking about earlier, like unaddressed. And the other thing that it does is because it feels like so viscerally that it's happening to you, that you aren't able to take distance from it as you would from a film and say, okay, actually, what's the message of this film? What's happening to me? What's the undertones here? It's so viscerally happening to you, you can't really take that perspective. So that can be dangerous. That can be particularly dangerous when you're talking about documentary stories, real life stories, and this implication that everything you're seeing is true, that this is real, that this is how things really are.
Yeah, you would kind of regard, like we were saying, VR makes people, you kind of believe it more, you think it's honest because there can be less cuts and things, but it doesn't mean that filmmakers can still be exploitative with their filmmaking.
This particular experience is called Hunger in Los Angeles, which is Noni de la Peña's piece, who's also a grandfather of VR, grandmother of VR, so it's okay to start critiquing her work.
Big boss.
She's a big boss. In this piece, it's real-life audio of a line for food stamps in America, and she's animated it with these VR, what would you call them? Models, figures, and you get to watch as one guy who has diabetes and is waiting in line collapses in front of you, and it was touted at first as this amazing feat of empathy because people kneel down, they try and help him, they try and sit around him and comfort him, and people come out feeling really emotional. But the problem with that being is you know, where are we watching VR and who gets to watch VR? That's one big thing. If you're watching this in a film festival and you come out, it doesn't really lend itself to the full weight of this subject, which is something really that happened and is a really important thing to think about. And if you just watch it in this kind of gimmicky way with avatars and maybe see it as a kind of exciting experience, which VR can sometimes be, like, what's the ethics of doing that? And it's something that we're really interested in.
When Tessa says film festival, generally a lot of VR festivals will have kind of experiences where you have to queue for, so you watch it, stick it on, take it off, leave, and there's no kind of moment to slowly go in or out of the experience or share it with another person. So that's what we're kind of saying as well.
Oh, so here's a video which I might be able to play, or if someone could press play.
A magic button.
So this is might make the sound. Okay. So this is an advert that was used by Tribeca Film Festival.
Simmer down.
VR side. It's a really interesting video that highlights possibly one of the biggest problems about touting machines. So as you can see, there's people from different walks of life, women and men, people of different religions, walking across the city and seeing each other in these VR boxes. So it's obviously a reference to the kind of VR where you jump inside someone's body, you look down, you're someone else and you're in their situation, and the implication that maybe you can understand a bit more about where they come from, how they live, possibly highlighted actually is not you necessarily seeing this other person, but you're seeing yourself reflected in that person. And so at worst, what this is implying, apart from real empathy, which is understanding that our situations are very different, and there's a kind of leap of understanding that it will take me to think of what your experience is, that's real empathy. All you're doing in this scenario is possibly reducing the world to, oh, we're all the same, which obviously doesn't make account for different lived experience and what it's like to live in a different body than your own. And at its worst, it's saying, I know exactly what it's like to be you, and actually this is just a kind of narcissistic experience for me to hop inside of the world and see the world from the point of view of X, from the point of view of a woman sold into sex slavery. So when we are teaching VR in our workshops to our collaboratives, one of our big, can I do it anymore?
Next page, please. Perfect.
Is don't make this, don't make...
So basically don't think of VR as you're jumping in a bubble or a costume of someone else. You're not wearing someone else's life for a minute just to take it off and go. It's like also kind of along the lines of like we were saying with the bad side of experiential, it's worth thinking about not kind of making something that's shocking or traumatizing. You need to kind of think about what you're making, why you're doing it, does it have meaning, and yeah, if it's in a way traumatic or...
Yeah, it's not just about entertainment. It's not like an emotional version of a roller coaster. These are people's real stories, and you have to...
And it's really important to learn this kind of language and think about these things as it's a new medium, and obviously it's almost like if it falls into the wrong hands, but like as makers you just need to be thoughtful with what you're doing, because this is what people might see for the first time ever and have an opinion of all of VR because they've seen your piece.
So we've got a couple of case studies here of stuff that we think is really amazing and possibly like boundary pushing inside VR. This is Carney Arena. Picture's not come across that well on the top there, but it's a full installation. So instead of just putting a headset on, you actually have to go to a location, you take off your shoes, you're taken into this room where the floor is full of sand, and then you put on the headset and you experience the stories of Central American migrants who are crossing the border into America. And obviously this has as much to owe to cinema as it does something like installation art. It makes you go through an experience to learn something, and that's something that VR can really do. It can really push audiences to transform what they're thinking through a transformative experience. Shall I go to the next one?
So we've got quotes under our case studies here from the creators and things that kind of show as well that the creator was really thinking about what they're doing and like involved, like including the subject with their creation in not through a voyeuristic lens way, but through a
collaborative process. Symbiotic, yeah. This one, The Machine to Be Another, is a really amazing example. I was talking about first-person VR. This experience, rather than trying to give you a window into someone else's lived experience, it literally places two participants together, and they get to experience a body swap between each other. So it's very intimate. It's been... People come out of it saying it's absolutely life-changing to have that sudden understanding that you live your whole life from inside your body and how different it might be to live inside somebody else's body. Here's some examples on the side. And it's also an open access format. So Machine to Be Another, anybody can make work with the Machine to Be Another technology and with the Machine to Be Another format. So that makes it also very accessible and a really open source way of working.
So this example, there's a quote from Lynette Walworth, it's very interesting. Basically, it's about the tribe of the Yawanawa. So this was made completely in collaboration with this tribe. Essentially, the creator kind of took VR technology to the shaman who basically said that the technology is was in line, if not their own technology of the peoples was this before it, in the way that they basically drink a special ayahuasca tea and have visions of the forest to get in tune with nature. And so essentially they were like, oh, VR is exactly what we do already, let's make this together. And so the piece is definitely half and half the creator and the peoples that it's based off. It's not like a subject. The co-collaboration has made this really interesting kind of mixed reality. So there's a augmented part of the experience. If you wear a bracelet that is made by the people, you can see one of the bioluminescent butterflies that's in the forest as well. They captured the forest in its kind of bioluminescent state as well, and has that in experience. There's a 360 eye contact point between the shaman, and at one point they pray for you, and it's actually not even a kind of scripted moment where the filmmaker said, oh, can you look into the camera and pray for the audience? It's the shaman essentially, when they pray for not only themselves, their people, but everyone in the world. So essentially it's not even a step up from that. So I just really like how this piece is so together with the subject, and it's somehow completely not exploitative or that kind of fake faux documentary making at all. It's really nicely made, basically.
And then We Wait is a famous example of, it's from the BBC studios and Aardman, and it's features stories of Turkish migrants who cross the Mediterranean in a boat. And in the experience, you're in the boat with these animated characters who take you through some real-life stories of people who've made this journey. This piece, it's something that lots of VR is made about, the refugee crisis, but this piece is particularly interesting because not only did they make the characters into animations, which in a way actually kind of makes this piece more respectful. It's like it then becomes a more...
It's like fictitious documentary, like it's based off real life, and it's not fake, but it's, yeah, kind of got a nice distance to...
If you can imagine using real refugees to recreate the experience of crossing the Mediterranean, it's an ethical minefield, so that's one of the ways that they go around this. It's also allows you to have that critical distance, which I think is really important, because they're not real people. You can think about the story from a little bit of a step back in perspective. And also the other amazing thing about this piece is that the characters don't talk to you unless you're looking at them. So when some, in especially 360 video where it's just shot and it just runs continuously, you find people not concentrating, especially if people haven't done VR before, they're going to be amazed at the chair that they're on and how real that looks, and maybe not paying enough attention to what is actually someone's real life experience that's going on in front of you. So this negates that problem. It means that audiences have to take a bit of responsibility. If they want to hear the story, they have to make eye contact with the characters.
Which is also obviously a really good, powerful way of making something in 360 is eye contact is basically everything if you want to engage someone with a character, like we were saying.
And this is a great example of that, actually.
Oh yeah, so this is the Testimony Project. It not only kind of exists as a 360 film, it's a platform for survivors of sexual assault to speak their story and for the viewer to bear witness. So it's all about just these people talking about what happened to them, and for the viewer to just accept it and listen and you know, acknowledge what's happened. So this is done in a kind of clever way. It's not even specifically 360. It's shot traditionally. So if you imagine kind of, it's this kind of framing of these women, and it kind of floats, as you can see in the bottom picture, around you. If you want to listen to a story, you kind of gaze. You're encouraged to lean into this woman or the survivor, and their image comes closer to you. You hear this interview as she recounts her story. If you want to look away or back out, or if it's too much for you, you can even look away and it'll kind of slowly fade. So it does a really good job of being respectful for both the viewer watching, if they get too overwhelmed, and also for these stories being told. Then you can't like cut them off suddenly. It's like a really clever way of tackling a really sensitive subject.
And yeah, these are just some kind of our top tips, I would say.
Well, we don't necessarily agree on all of these top tips as well. So this is kind of a part of what we're about in our collaborative as well, is just starting a discussion to talk about these things. And obviously you don't have to follow, these aren't rules for you to really follow. If we talk about how we make content, we can kind of, if you just think about it just a little bit more critically than just like, I'm going to make this, it looks cool. No offense, if any of you have made that kind of content, experimental or abstract, VR is great, and I'm always going to support all types of VR, but this is just in lieu with our talk.
Yes, also something I guess that we should say is that we think that one of the most amazing things about VR is that if you are thinking critically and you are thinking about some of these pointers, it's possible that you might make something that is as impactful, if not more, than someone who's working with the latest drone technology or the higher spec cameras, because actually it's about the storytelling and it's about how you've used VR to its best abilities that makes the most effective piece. There's an unlimited amount of stuff on the Oculus store and anywhere else that you might see VR that is really well made, but totally naff, and they haven't thought about anything. So that's quite empowering for someone who's just starting out making VR. But anyway, here's our points.
Basically, it's just a straightforward point. in the industry, people say empathy all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean anything at this point because it just kind of vaguely has this concept beyond what people defining what empathy is. It's a buzzword, it's thrown around just because something is said to be empathetic. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has been thought through seriously enough. Make your films with contributors, not subjects. So if you're making a documentary, which is like a very, very common genre in VR, I personally think it's really important to properly collaborate with your subjects, that I call them contributors as well. Make sure they're completely happy with what's going on, because you can still edit in 360 and cut something up to be not what they were initially interviewed for, or if you don't get them to sign contracts or whatever, they need to know the context, and you want to be helping them, not just making something about them and then, just taking a picture and going. Like, that's kind of ethics that you see in all kinds of media, like film and photography. It stands with VR too.
Check pushing boundaries. I guess what we mean in this one is you want to push boundaries of any medium, but it's gone out of my head now.
Just that, yeah. If you obviously, because it's a new medium, people can kind of be persuaded into it. Like, they might just not understand that it can be so intrusive. Like, you could film in someone's personal living room, and like that, obviously, they might not realise that someone can see their entire house, or maybe their license plate, or just things like that. People might not be aware, so you just make sure you check what you're doing. Also,
I guess in this kind of making empathy VR, it sometimes feels like the drive is to make your audience cry, to make something the most upsetting thing you possibly can, whereas actually the work that's impacted me the most, like Jaisha Patel's work and like neurospeculative Afrofeminism, it's positive, and it changed my opinion without just trying to shock me, basically. It's not just trying to milk emotions. Do we have much time? I'm aware of time.
Where am I looking?
Are we okay?
Are we okay for time? Okay.
Oh, great.
Oh, that's perfect. So, like, basically what we've been saying this whole talk, benefit society and the world around you. Obviously, you don't have to. Things can be made for fun. However, if you're going to make something, especially if it's documentary, it's worth thinking about, is it going to improve a community? Is it going to say anything? Is it going to change opinions in the right way? Is it challenging perspectives, or is it kind of looking through a voyeuristic lens and then leaving them forever? If you film something like a shocking catastrophe, do you go back to the people after and see how it's been going, essentially, and if people still care about this cause, same as a lot of charity content and stuff like that?
Yeah, and what's your outreach plan for the content as well? If you're just going to make these documentaries, show them at a few festivals for your own sake, what does that mean about the film that you just made, basically?
Yeah, show it to people if you make it about them as well.
And I guess what we were also talking about earlier is that, like, these concepts of ethical documentary making, they already exist, and it has seemed like, because VR is so new, people maybe aren't being as critical as they would be of traditional cinema. So I think it's really important that we build up a critical practice around documentary making in VR.
More.
These are some we disagree about. Yeah,
so you don't have to add trigger warnings, but particularly maybe if you're going to do the kind of filmmaking where you want to make someone cry, or you want to affect them heavily, VR obviously is way more, like we were saying, visceral. So maybe you don't want to throw someone in that with no context. You want to let them know what they're going into, but you might not want to do that as well.
Similarly, I feel like you actually, as a filmmaker, you don't know what your audience is going to find triggering, because you don't know anything about that person's life. So you could say, oh, this film, you'll be fine, you won't be upset by it, but actually the context of making a film about someone, you just basically don't know what your audience are going to find triggering. So I think it's a far cry to say that you could warn them about it.
Yeah, and then like what we said about the festival queuing experience, you might want to think about how you're screening your content. If it's, say, again, at something like a festival, you might be hearing like the crowd around you. You might want the space to be something where people can talk about it after with other people or with you, the filmmaker. Obviously, VR doesn't have a particular perfect setup of how it's screened, so you can facilitate that. You can pick how people view it.
Yeah, we actually both screened a work. It's not our work. It's by Hazel Grain, another VR filmmaker who made
in Bristol.
Pardon?
In Bristol, the UK.
In Bristol, yeah. About her experience of having an attempt made on her life, but the film is about how all the emergency services and her neighbours around her kind of came together to help her through her experience, and that's told in a kind of choral way, so through song. And the experience is just one-on-one. It's not like any of the headsets are connected, but she insists that it's shown to people in groups, because it is just such an emotional story and such an emotional process that people need to come out of it and spend some time talking to each other. And the film is about community, so it just makes sense to show it that way, even though technically it doesn't have to be.
So if you make something, you can just pick how you want it to be shown. So slow ins, outs, fades, pacing. Obviously, with sharp cuts in VR, as I'm sure a lot of you who've used it have experienced, it's a bit like you're being teleported and just thrown into a new scene every time there's a cut or a shot change. So basically, consider if a lot more fades, a lot more slow pacing, long shots. I would suggest 6 seconds. And yeah, the ability to pause the experience, take a break, basically just if it's something heavy, again, like we say, the kind of charity content that we were talking about, you might want to have the option for people to just take a moment, or a long, maybe black screen or something.
Or like how the witness experience does allow you to take breaks as you're watching it, so you don't get overloaded with the content, but you can give the content its due gravity. And finally, the biggest point for me is to not fetishize the technology over the story. Like I was saying, you see so much work, especially already existing in the ether, where people have just been so excited by a new technology, by adding AI into this story, that they've forgotten actually what the story's about and what it's supposed to do, and actually what could be inspiring, what should be the most inspiring thing to people who want to start making VR and VR documentaries, is that if you've thought your process through, if you know why you're using VR and what makes it a good medium for your film that you're trying to make, then you can definitely make something that has massive impact that doesn't necessarily have to have cost the earth.
Yeah. Right, I think...
Should we open it up for questions?
So usually what we're about are collaborative. When we do workshops, it's kind of like a discussion. Everyone can share and ask questions. So if you're happy having people ask questions.
I'll gladly be the mic boy.
Okay.
Yeah, we've also got some more VR experts in the room that just came in, so ask any questions.
I'll gather up the hands and then give out the microphone. So there's one. Was there a hand?
No, we just pointed to them.
Making them wave. No.
Do you want it?
Also, you can ask us opinions on anything in the industry as well. We're not just specifically ethics, if you like.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. I liked what you picked up on that what's lacking right now is the critical discourse on VR films, right? Because you'd get in the performance studies and films, and some of those reviews are art pieces of their own kind. I actually happen not to like Chris Milk films.
Yes.
And especially since you touched upon the subject on empathy, and I suppose that was his phrase, that VR is the empathy machine. Yeah. And what I find about his films, they're not, from at least from my perspective, that empathetic. There are some other films. Yeah, and so the question would be, what do you think it's impeding the development of the critical discourse in VR films? Because if you go on Samsung VR, you see at least 50%. Some are wonderful pieces, and some of them are really substandard. And so this critical discourse is lacking. And what's impeding it, and how would we speed it up?
I think one thing that I've really noticed is that nobody reviews VR, or you get people who trash the technology. The people come out and say, "Magic Leap, it's nothing." This camera isn't good enough. But nobody says, "Okay, what's this film like you would in any theatre piece, you get hundreds of reviews about what it's actually about. Nobody's reviewing VR, and I think possibly that might have something to do about the way it's showed, particularly in festivals, is that you come out of the experience and the person who's made it is right there. Someone is there watching you come out of the headset and asks you, how was it? And you're kind of forced to answer in the moment that it was good, and people don't feel empowered to. I think that's part of our workshops, is like, you can have, even if you've never made VR before, you can have something to say about it just by possibly thinking about, like, what's the greater message of the film, or like, what is the context of this film, for example. I think when people do start reviewing VR, that will be like a massive change.
A really nice kind of journalist, podcaster, Kent Bai, does a lot of good reviews. You don't, again, obviously don't always agree with him, but he does critique things quite interestingly. And a great podcast for a nice train ride, or I would recommend. Thank you.
So, is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Oh, another one.
Yeah, go for it.
I'll ask again. And then you showed this hunger in Los Angeles, right? Did you find it really that empathetic? Because no. That's exactly it. So they take this subject. I guess my concern is with the lack of the public and sort of critical discourse is that, and she had made a big sort of noise about this film, that this is the empathetic film ever, and then you go and what's going on? The guy just dies in front of you.
Yeah.
And so instead of having positive experience, you actually have a negative. You're just like, oh, well, tough luck. So how would you, again, one thing is a critique, but, and you pointed out very correctly, like in the film festivals, the filmmaker comes out, and if he asks you, how was it? And it's kind of a little bit dicey, actually, to say honest opinion. But how would you approach specifically, besides this public discourse, the big names like her, like Chris Milk, and the other ones?
We are being recorded, so no. I would say one of the things I find really interesting. So I've shown one of Noni's pieces to audiences, and I've also shown another piece which I can't bring to mind right now what it's called, but it's Gabarora's piece about the going through the concentration camp. Have you seen that one? One thing that happens all the time is you get some people who are really moved by the story and really paying attention. You get other people who are just so overwhelmed by how technically amazing it is that they're off to the side looking at how amazing this LiDAR scanning, in the example of the Holocaust survivor story, I saw someone just really looking at a tap that had been LiDAR scanned and really amazed about how well this tap had been rendered, when you've actually got somebody recounting their experience of being in a concentration camp on the other side of the room. I think obviously part of that's going to die when it becomes less and less amazing to be inside VR. But I also think you should be building that critique into your work as a maker. So the examples that we showed of Witness, where also We Wait, where you don't get to hear the story of these refugees unless you're looking at them, unless you are making eye contact with them. I think to build in kind of audience responsibility into the works is something that would change how people kind of perceive those works.
Yeah, I would say it's more people watching it and it becoming more normal and in home, and the more likely everyone's seen something that will start to happen. Hopefully conversations like that will start to happen, and also just talking about something with someone else who's seen it. Obviously, unless you go to lots of networking events and VR festivals, sometimes you might not be able to talk about the same experience with someone and have different things that happened. I'm just adding on to what you said. I think it's quite funny with, it's the same thing as if you gave someone too much freedom to interact and it was a bit too fun while it was serious, when you're trying to show a friend a game or something and they're not paying attention to the story. Same with a film, if someone gets distracted or if it's too interactable and you can pick up plates while someone's crying at you like that. Always, I think people need to find a little medium with that as well. Just adding that. Thank you.
I think there's, I have a personal question. Well,
Please.
not personal, but a question personally. That would be more precise. Like, how does making content that others can empathize with work for the content creator? Because, yeah, it's, you mentioned this, like, you need this diverse cast of people in order to accurately represent the feeling. But there is also this problem that you can only invoke I at least believe so, that you can only invoke feelings with metaphors, and that does the diverse cast of people really, or rather, is creating content that the other person can empathize with more the role of the viewer, who is like prepared to you know, receive the message, or is it more like the task of the content creator who has to somehow predict the right kinds of metaphors?
I think it's definitely like a challenge for the content creator, that you are making something, like, as we've said, that's not exploitative, that's not just serves the purpose of giving the viewer this emotional version of a roller coaster. We go up, it's really bad, and then we come down, and then we cry. Like, that shouldn't be what we're trying to do. It shouldn't be this something that's also lodged at Noni's work, is that it's this kind of pain tourism, that you get to, like, put the headset on, visit a painful experience, feel catharsis from that, and take the headset off. And I think that's a challenge to makers, that you're not using people's stories for this purpose, but that you're using what is the most amazing thing about VR, which is that when I put that headset on, just through the act of doing it, I suddenly realized that my whole life is mediated by the fact that I experience it out my own eyes, you know, and so I'm always in the room. And what VR can do is take us into spaces where we aren't, where we can't go, and show us what it might be like for us not to be there, you know, especially in, you know, these present times, as a way of checking your privilege as someone who's able to go and do whatever you want, to be able to kind of understand what that privilege actually means. I think that's something that VR could definitely do. Did that really answer the question?
Maybe.
Yeah, it sort of does. Yeah.
I was just going to say, there was something said in our last talk which was really, really relevant, which was the fact that when you're making a traditional film, you have a window and it's like a frame, and you're implying an opinion or kind of an attitude, or you're implying something as a filmmaker by putting shots next to each other, and you watch it and you come to the sum of what those shots mean. With VR, you don't have a frame, you just shoot everything, and people are kind of trying to, you're more intending for your viewers to take steps towards coming to their own conclusion rather than forcing them to think something. They kind of they experience something firsthand, and then hopefully come to their own thoughts, and without being too pushed into a corner.
The like relationship between what a director and an audience member is really fundamentally changed by the fact that you can't actually control where your audience is going to look, even if you use all the best, you know, distraction techniques in the world. And so actually that's not what you should be trying to do in VR. I don't think, that's my personal opinion, that actually VR is much more about experience sharing. And that's why it's so important that not only there's a diverse group of people represented inside the film, but also behind the camera, the people who are allowed to make this work, which is why we try and have opened up our collaborative so much in Bristol, is to try and encourage other voices of people who think, maybe I'm not that techie, I'm not that filmy, I don't have anything to say in VR, whereas actually it's about empowering people to feel like, you know, people's stories are getting told, whether you like it or not, so it might as well be you that is the driving force behind that, if you've got, you know, something about your life that should be shared.
Awesome, thanks. Okay. So, is there anybody else who wants to ask a question? Probably the final one. Sounds like a no.
Feel free to hit us up to chat with us after. We don't mind.
And you can go to our website if you like.
Awesome. Let's give a round of applause for the Othvrs. Awesome. So I think the conclusion that I at least like took away this idea that you know, everything you do is always going to feel normal, and you have no idea how weird actually the way you live really is. You can't really step outside of your own reality. But let's hold this thought. Let's you know, share these conclusions because it's worth talking about. But right now we're going for a small. Let's watch some drone. That is open, yeah. The open film contest finalists, and right after that we're going to have a panel.
Я слышу, как струны деревьев играют ее. Музыку волн, музыку ветра. Музыку волн, музыку ветра. Здесь трудно сказать, что такое асфальт. Здесь трудно сказать, что такое машина. Здесь нужно руками кидать воду вверх. Музыка волн, музыка ветра. Музыку волн, музыку ветра.
after rain. With a pinkish tinge. A soft grey light. A man with a black and white dog. A slice of sun at the base of the clouds. I don't know why I walk back from work that way. I usually go past the shops. But I was later tonight. It wasn't dark. And this is a safe place. Dear Rich, I know you would laugh at my suburban house and a tree-lined road, my teaching job, a partner older than me. With you, it was as if each moment dazzled. We were always moving. Never settled. That day I walked to your last place. The Greyhound bus stopped near the store. I walked past the car lot and the factory block and down your street, a tree-lined street, and the leaves were just out, pale leaves, an evening sun, low light on bricks. I didn't know the names of the trees. It was your country. I didn't know the names of trees.
Sycamore, bucca, cedar.
Hey everybody, so we're running into a small technical difficulty. We have half of the speakers missing. But let's start with what we have. So today's talk, the panel discussion is about new narratives, creating new narratives with new technologies. As I mentioned before, and so the others, it's quite difficult to understand what can you do and what can you not do. So it's all totally new and we're all totally experimenting. But we do have a lot of experience with movies. We do have some experience with medicine, and we do have some experience with gaming. So right off the bat, I'd like to invite on stage one of the speakers. So it's Marina Petrakova. And another one who's present at this moment, Aigars Ceplitis. So they will be representing the medicinal side and the VR side of things, respectively. And first of all, it would be really useful to actually define what exactly VR is. Maybe you can maybe you could take it away.
Okay. So there are actually two schools or two strands, and the one is generally represented by game designers, and they actually object the use of the word VR the way the filmmakers very often do. And it's partially to do the game designers say, well, if you can't be interactive in space, that is, instead of simply twisting around and kind of looking the direction, if you can move and you can interact and affect the characters, it's not VR. Now, the filmmakers who actually, we had a good presentation just before us when she was talking about the film VR. She says, the other school says basically that no, it is a VR, even if it's what you call pre-rendered, that is something that's been shot and laid out in 360, on two grounds: that there is some interactivity, which is like you can kind of look around. And then their argument is that the audience, let's say in the game, is a bad storyteller. So that it's actually a filmmaker who can actually direct the story. Now, so there is some validity to that. Now, there is a big discussion, and I think in my presentation I mentioned that I was looking at this concept with cinematic VR. So, and I think it's more precise of what we are dealing with, what you call virtual reality that's been shot by video or even a little bit manipulated with. Now, and I was looking up who actually coined the term, and it turned out that there was a guy, I forgot his last name, it's in my presentation, but he owns actually VR studio, and he's the first one who named cinematic VR. It's very specific. Now, in his view, it is very inappropriate to speak of cinematic VR films that are not 3D. In his view, if you want to talk about cinematic VR, it has to have two technological agencies. One, it has to be 3D, and the second one, it has to be ambisonic sound. And as far as myself, I actually subscribe to that point of view. It doesn't mean that I disregard and, my greatest respect to all other filmmakers who actually work in 360 that are not 3D, because, 3D filmmaking is much more cumbersome and also more expensive. But I would say that, yes, cinematic VR would require actually 3D or stereoscopic extension. But that's just my take on that.
All right. So, but there is quite this weird thing. So it's there's a reason why virtual reality is called immersive tech. Maybe Marina, can you tell me a bit more about how exactly this immersion part works, or maybe Aigars, whichever you prefer to begin.
Okay, hello everyone, my name is Marina, and currently I'm working on my project which is connected to virtual reality. I'm creating the platform which heals and provides therapy for different people, for children, and we are using virtual reality. So the basic thing which we use that all of the people like to play, and all the people like to interact with something. So when you are interested in something, then we can achieve. So immersiveness is when are used all of your sensory system. It is vision, it is perception, it is proprioception sometimes. This is the thing when your body is moving and the inner receptors, they are receiving the information about position of your body. And then if we creating the content where which is supposed to make person interact, then we can do anything, because that what we would like to get, to engage person, to encourage person, every person, like child or someone to who you would like to sell something. I mean, your business idea or something, or cinema. Then you just have to understand how to create contact which will encourage and motivate person to interact. And virtual reality is the perfect tool for that, because it's used sensor, like a visual sensory system, perception is used, your hearing, so everything is used. So that's why virtual reality is perfect tool for cinema, for everything.
Well, can I ask her a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
No, what Kaspars said, he was actually more specific when he talked about immersion, and people talk immersion, empathy, embodiment, and very often they conflate these terms. And when you start asking them, what do you mean by presence, what do you mean by telepresence, then they can't actually. Now, are you saying that if you have ability to move, or right, is it requirement for immersion, or if I have a desire to move on a cognitive level? Because in 360, very often, you can't physically move. Right, you can move in some real virtual reality games, right? But if you talk about cinematic VR, you might have the way the story can be structured, it might create the desire on the cognitive level for you to move, although physically you can move. Would that constitute for you as well immersion? What is your, because Kaspars, if I understood your correctly question, what exactly is immersion in your view, correct?
Yeah, the feeling, like...
The feeling. Does the feeling actually require ability to move, or that's sufficient for you, a desire to move?
For me, it's for a person who is interested into neurophysiology. I would say that it doesn't require physical movements, but sometimes, of course, we can use this for make the experience more immersive. So it depends from the goal which we aim. For example, if we are talking about rehabilitation, then some of the patients cannot move. But if we talk about normal people who are about to experience something very great, then of course we have to use the physical ability to move, the body movements.
All right, but it sounds like the actorship is completely different in virtual reality, that there is this sort of extra dimension, perhaps given to the viewer because he has the ability to partake in the story. But I guess that is more of a game development question. But there would be the reasonable question, like when does it turn from a game into a VR experience, sort of like this thing. But I think when we're talking about the technology, it also I guess gives us a certain direction. This technology gives us constraints on what we can do. So what exactly are or rather, no, let's take it from the completely different perspective. Can you, so this is Janis Putnins. He is the director of the Latvian Culture Academy Film School.
National Film School.
National Film School.
Right.
National, oh, one very important word.
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask, how has the advancement of technology for regular two-dimensional screens had an impact on film watching, in your opinion?
Negative. I would definitely say that the experience is completely different, but it's not really noticeable on the surface, because we don't really spend half of the time watching a film in complete darkness nowadays. Yeah? But we just don't notice it, and I think it's on a very basic level. The experience is very, very different, and we cannot really deny it, or we cannot really kind of notice with our senses. So that's my very, very simple take on it.
Can you elaborate? So what you're saying is that we can't tell the difference in the way we watch films because it's so normal to us? Or could you rephrase and be more specific?
Yes, because the analog mechanical function of the projector requires that the equal time spent with an image, with a still photograph, is followed by an equal time of complete darkness, which is not necessary by digital projection. And that's a crucial difference in my opinion. But okay, I'm becoming a little bit maybe too esoteric and going into some kind of field of sensory reception, which is more probably connected with a different no, actually it is somehow connected with the topic of our conversation, virtual reality, but in a different sense, yes. Sensory reception of stimuli.
Okay, but it sounds more like that...
I don't see, actually, I don't see any progress in technology, to be honest. Yes.
Okay.
I can only see a more convenient way of making films. It's not necessarily progress.
Okay, then what would constitute progress for you in filmmaking? For example, like, okay, or let's be more specific, then why would VR, for example, if we have if we have this hypothesis that it has this extra dimension of you know, immersion, why, yeah, or being able to move around, why is this not progress? Or
I don't think we can really talk about virtual reality entering the film experience yet. I haven't really seen any examples. I was really hoping. I just went to Moscow to a film festival, and they were showing a film by the famous Taiwanese director Tsai Ming-liang, which is called The Deserted, which is made as a VR film. And people who had seen it told me that, well, that's kind of resembling a real film. It's not just a gimmick exploring like these possibilities of virtual reality, but it's a real film. You should see it. But I couldn't see it, despite my kind of like VIP status. It was impossible because, of course, these gadgets which are necessary to watch this film are only limited in quantity. Only 10 people per one screening can see it, and I couldn't manage to see it. So I am still left in a land of not knowing anything about this.
Okay.
Yes, I would not necessarily call any technical advance or any kind of potential technical gimmick in advance. Yes. We've gone through several phases. Like we can of course mention 50s when the widescreen cinema appeared, anamorphic films, and then we can talk about 3D also in the 50s. But those so-called advancements, progress, they died pretty quickly once they exhausted their newness, their novelty.
Is that the case for you?
No, not really. I mean, this is an interesting aspect. If I understand what Janis said, that there is no really progress in filmmaking. But again, as you know, I'm purely structuralist, you know, and maybe I need to talk about my PhD research to understand where I'm coming from.
Yes, please explain it in the human.
Okay, is this working, right? So, is it on? So basically, I'm purely structuralist. For those who actually know what the nerdology is, it's a structuralist view of storytelling, as opposed to actual storytelling is actually looking at the mechanics of the storytelling. What are the the factors that make story effective from the narratological perspective, such as voice, embedding, narrative levels, point of view, perspective, focalization, etc. And what I'm doing this research, which actually, here it is. So basically what I do is, I do these observational studies with students where I show them a number of films. And basically they analyze different VR films, and then later on they do different fill-in questionnaires very similar to the one that game designers use. And what I do, I actually measure what I call immersive factor, how immersive there's a specific point of view, let's say whether the story is told from the first person perspective, second person perspective. And so what I came up with is I built up my, what I call, it's not moving forward. Anyhow, I built up my, what I call the narrative matrix. And in that narrative matrix, you can look, the filmmakers can look at which narrative factors actually make a more immersive experience. And what I found is I'm also flying to Florence next week. I'm doing a paper presentation on the second person perspective. And if you, Janis, know very well, probably maybe you disagree with me, but I think if you look at the Hollywood films, especially Golden Era Hollywood, there are not many films that are done from the second person perspective. You have a Dark Passage, you have Double Indemnity. Lady in the Lake, that's correct. And that's partially just in literature. The second perspective is very unnatural, whereas in the 3D, 360 3D, I actually could prove it empirically because we did observational studies with 64 students. And when they filled in, I can, maybe later on I'll show actually the matrix. When the computer spilled out the data, you could actually clearly see that for second person perspective, that's something the previous speaker a little bit talked about, where the person speaks to the camera, where there's action, and sometimes he engages the viewer, is what I would say one of the most natural habitats of the narrative structures within 360 3D. So I'm not I partially agree with that the advancement is not as aggressive, but does it affect actually the storytelling and the new storytelling techniques as a medium? I think it does. Where it's going to, I'm still in the research phase, and I can't tell definitely that it's, but one is very clear that the biggest mistake that the filmmakers make who do these 360 films, particularly 3D, is that they use old filmmaking techniques. And then that's already been reiterated many times by many experts, and I've been very adamant about that. It's almost you have to look at the product from I mean, the classical film techniques do not work in this medium.
I just wanted to add that it's interesting that you mentioned these second-person films, because there is one very interesting director working kind of like in a conventional classical film manner, but with a very, very slight but important difference. And I wanted to mention Laszlo Nemes, the Hungarian film director who made Son of Saul. And I think if we talk about the second-person perspective, or first-person perspective, subjective perspective, then we can. It works much better than these films which were trying to mimic the human gaze, because the camera cannot reproduce some very important aspects, which are like the peripheral vision. But it was possible to do by using, I would call it a psychologically immersive process. Yeah? If you've seen a film of Son of Saul, then you probably understand what I mean. And that kind of really, this like close-up to...
Can you give me like at least one instance from his technique when you, because what I hear, this is very interesting when you bring up this whole peripheral vision.
Yes.
You know, because in 360, that's particularly 3D, that's natural.
That's what I wanted to mention, because it's completely different approach. It's not trying to create a 360 reality per se, but it kind of mimics within the film reality, this kind of very subjective experience, which 360 reality is the 360 VR is trying to reproduce, and that's the film's Son of Saul. Have you seen it?
I will definitely watch it, but I'm not sure.
You should see it, because it's basically the entire film is following the main protagonist very closely. Either you see from his perspective, his point of view shots, or you see him in a frame, in a close-up. Yeah? What that means, it kind of like mimics, and of course, if he's in a close-up, the background is slightly blurred, yes? And it kind of mimics the psychology of the character. And this Riga International Film Festival, on the 26th and 31st, there'll be his newest film, which is called Twilight, which uses the same method, but in a completely different setup. And I would really strongly recommend to see it, because it also kind of emulates the state of human, I would kind of wanted to use some kind of existential Heideggerian term of like being thrown in the world, like being in a complete almost nakedness in front of the reality, because you don't know what's gonna happen. Like the narrative devices which he initializes by using this approach, you know, are completely different. But I didn't.
I will kind of a little bit pick up on the word you use. I guess simulate. What I find personally, the 360, particularly 3D, does not attempt to simulate second. It naturally defaults into that,
yes, exactly.
As opposed to, let's say, what you're saying. It's more a simulation.
But
and another aspect which I found about 360, particularly 3D, and again, a lot of these my sort of claims are actually empirically substantiated by, because I mean, I did interviews, and they're not only processed through the special database, will give you a very proper sort of matrix of what works, what doesn't. But another one, which was like even in live interviews, one which answered that was very, I found very peculiar about the time perception. Let's say 360, 3D, which is interesting, like the question, for instance, slow motion effect. Slow motion, when I interviewed people, majority of them found a very natural effect in 360 3D. In film, you do notice slow motion effect, because that's something that stands out as a technique, but there's something psychological perception, how we perceive time. And I remember this one kid said, you know, I really like this 360 3D film because that's how I perceive time when I'm skateboarding and I'm falling off the skateboard. I mean, the whole or I had somebody said, like, I was in a car accident, and it's just that moment, that extension of time of the car accident. He said, this is exactly how I feel when I'm 360. So again, I would say that there is this advancement, at least of specific techniques that kind of open possibilities for more deployment and experimentation.
Oh, yes.
But I will totally definitely, thank you for that suggestion. I'll definitely check that film out.
You should check it, because it's different. It has nothing to do with, with virtual reality, but it's kind of like creates this immersive experience. Yeah. But I definitely agree that we don't really know which way it's going to go, and it's very fascinating, and I just want to see some tangible tangible examples for myself, which could persuade me that it's not just a very useful tool for game developers and for some experiences, random experiences, which you can live through, but it can be used to tell stories and to use it as a cinematic means of expression.
By the way, do you all three have an agreement on how or whether you can measure or determine immersion?
Well, I have a...
Well, yeah, you mentioned it, but you never elaborated.
I do have, like, in my dissertation, I have a special chapter which actually have a matrix what I consider immersion for me. And they have different level. I have a visual immersion, and they have engagement, engrossment, full immersion. So when I do the actual measurements of the immersion against specific neurological canons, let's say embedding, you know, framing, or focalization, internal focalization, external focalization. I have a new concept which is completely exclusively for 360 3D, which is called reverse internal locus, and etc. These are interesting concepts. So then I use very specific. I use this full psychosomatic immersion. That is that you all cognitively and also you sort of viscerally and physically feel immersed. So because you can be visually immersed, but you might not be emotionally and psychologically immersed. You can be you can be engaged with the game, but doesn't mean that you are immersed with the game. So I mean, there are all these different. What I'm looking for, I'm looking which specific factors under which conditions make a viewer feel in the most immersive state. And my next question is, do the summation of these factors, if compiled specifically in the story, do they create this immersion state without, as you said, ability to actually move in space? And I found that yes, under certain conditions, it's possible.
What kind of conditions, can I ask? I mean, what kind of conditions you mean?
You would, let's say, I have this one story where, because I do these political vignettes, and for instance, there's this situation where the girl comes out on the balcony and then she meets a boy, and there's a switch of focalization. You suddenly, the camera is a girl, this boy is looking at you. Later on you find out there's a rape scene. So there is this kind of very yucky, unpleasant feel. That film is about sort of political scene in Latvia, how every new political party comes and offers you new things, and it's going to be great and it's going to be good, but eventually it rapes you. And so this is what the story is about. This young girl sort of represents metaphorically, the Latvian nation, and this young, beautiful boy represents a new political party, and he rapes her. So, but the way the story is structured, and I toy with this second-person perspective, it creates this yucky feeling. In that sense, I would say yes, at that point when it happens, it does have that psychological full immersion.
But then it just straight connected to emotional immersion, right? And psychological immersion.
No, it's also connected to visual, because I work exclusively in 3D.
Okay, so let's count all the kinds of immersion there are, because I think there's a mishmash with those.
No, there are different theories. First of all, you have to understand which model you use. If you use Laurie Ryan's immersion, she's very specific. As a matter of fact, she's the first author who dealt with the hypertext in video games, and she says there are three kinds of immersion. There's temporal, spatial, and there's emotional immersion, right? That's her model. Then there's a guy by name Fush. He has this visual immersion and full psychosomatic immersion.
Right.
So, and I kind of combine, for myself, I combine all of these two, plus I use another model which has three gradations, which is engagement, engrossment, and immersion.
Engagement. Okay. Can you explain, like in 2 sentences or 3, like a situation where, for example, one of these is present, but the other 2 are not? So,
okay, for instance, I can watch, as Janis said, I can watch, let's say, like I like animals, for instance, right? And I see like beer mama, right, we'll call it, with 2 beer cups. I love it. I feel like I'm almost embodied. I want to touch these kids because they're so cute, right? And in my family, because of social, cultural connotation, family is very important. And so that background really plays a role. So I'm engaged, and I could say, and the difference between engagement and engrossment adds emotional level. I would say I'm engrossed. However, if it was shot with 3D, and so I can give you another example. There's this wonderful film, 360 3D. There are some problems with it, but it's called My Africa Was In. If somebody has seen it, you saw it. And there's this beautiful shot. Do you remember when this lioness comes up and grabs that little, it's not a cow.
A cub?
No. It grabs the
gazelle?
Bison. Or gazelle, right? So the way she and the placement of one of the things that immersion also is very important, how camera is placed. Like in 360 3D, camera placement is very important in terms of the objects. It does increase or decrease your sense of presence, right? So where the camera was placed, that little lioness comes up and she's very mischievous, and then she's looking, and then there's bisons running, and she's like, and zap, right? You know, and this whole mischievousness, because I'm mischievous also by nature. So, well, all these factors play, and I feel very immersed. You know, I'm like, God, you know.
I relate to this.
I
You're
could
saying
relate, right, on all levels, emotionally, physically, and plus also spatially, because it's shot in three. I'm in that moment. Some of the shots, for instance, when suddenly voiceover comes in, it removes. And that's one of the things, that the consistency is a key. One of the things where virtual reality at this point is lacking is coherence and consistency. Well, like the film Janis referring to, I'm pretty sure it's pretty coherent and consistent from shot to shot to shot. One of the problems is of VR is lack of coherence. That's something we still need to learn. But look, it's still a very new medium. If somebody says that they have a grammar for VR, I think they're full of shit.
Well, by the way, you mentioned also the film, the VR film. What exactly makes it into a full-fledged film? Like what you?
I don't know.
Okay.
I want to find out. But knowing other films by Tsai-Ming Liang, I can well imagine that it could work quite well. But it's only for his style or style filmmakers similar in style to him, which is the slow, long takes, which kind of in VR might give some additional level of involvement or, well, actually cinematic power, add just to the cinematic power of these works.
I'm curious, like you mentioned about these sort of extended shots. Like that's one of the beauties of the regular cinema. You can watch it for a long, long time, right? Now, 360 3D, there's I mean, what is this from the perspective, I'm curious, from the neurocognitive perspective, how long can we, you know, because I personally never watch films that are three, even 20 minutes long. I don't like it.
Okay, what does mean long? You said like we don't have...
How long is the, you know, in virtual reality, what is the cutoff time before you really have a like mental exhaustion from
you have answered to your question because you said I cannot. That's the thing, because it works for everyone differently. Okay, we have the majority of people who are in the middle of the cognitive skills and they have a lot of energy. Their brain are working fastly in very rude saying, and they can use for a lot of hours. Like if you know what is happening in Asia, all of the people are into VR. They are buying everything in VR. They are playing. They are going to the doctor through VR. And they use VR on a daily basis, like for 5-6 hours and
so
even more.
So are you saying that biologically it's possible to be watching something in VR setting 5-6 hours?
Because your eyes adapt, your brains adapt, but it depends. It depends from the experience. It depends from your lifestyle. It depends, but yes, why not?
But you asked me about my criteria for immersion. I want to ask you a back sort of counter question. Do you have your own criteria for, you know,
for immersion?
No. For the lengths of time somebody can. Do you have a criteria by which you can say this is possible to really withstand?
Or like sitting, like imagine the computer, like there is this cap until it's sort of there's this guideline when it starts becoming unhealthy. Maybe there is something like that for VR as well.
Because in Stanford University, they actually did studies with VR, and this guy, professor, I forgot his last name. It's actually in my notes. If somebody wants it, I'll send it. He said his cutoff time for students was 20 minutes on VR. So, but apparently in Asian universities, it's longer. So.
But do we know the amount of pictures that they have, since not pictures but screens? Do we know what kind of glasses they used? What about the techniques? Do we know that? I mean, what they're described? Yeah, I mean, do we know that?
I just was reading the report. I didn't read actually.
Exactly. So it depends from the quality of screen. It depends of quality of the screen of a lot of technical things. For example, if you have very old glasses and very badly made platform or application, you cannot really use that.
So. Just a sec. Let's give it to the live streamers.
Sorry. I have a small opinion on this as well, because there's a big difference between VR and VR. You, sir, are talking about cinematic VR, and you're talking about interactive VR. And it's easy to spend 2 hours in interactive VR, but you can't do that with cinematic VR. So you're like talking next to each other in this particular...
Can you substantiate your difference?
Yeah, you're locked in someone else's perspective with cinematic VR, so you're constantly taking in someone else's impulses while you're controlling your own environment. You have much more rest and ease and comfort. You can take things slow, or you can speed them up the way you want to, and that you don't have that in cinematic VR. You're guided by the movie. It's a different experience, I think.
Up to a certain point. I mean, you can rewind it, you can skip it, you can scan it. I mean, that's one of the things of the VR spectatorship. You're not required under conditions to watch film from the beginning till end. No?
But you're still controlled. You don't control, you are controlled. And I think that is very exhausting instead of controlling the environment.
Is it true?
There is one little thing or super big thing that all of the brains have the quantity of the information that can be used in one time. I mean, sensory overload. It can happen to every person. Of course, if we talk about cinema, I have no clue how does it work, because I'm working completely different area when I can spend the time kind of 8 hours per day, and it's okay for me because screen is not moving. I'm just interacting with the objects or with the avatar. So if we talk about medicine or rehabilitation, it's completely different. If we talk about the...
even if it's spatial frames move, that is, if the setting moves, it changes, you don't have an overload.
No, me not really, because I get adapted. I'm doing this already for 1 year, kind of 3 times per week, kind of 4 hours, and I got adapted. But I mean, brains are very flexible. It depends to the content. It depends to your personal cognitive skills. So we can make a lot of researches. We can make researches in America, Latvia, wherever. But the one thing is the same. Brain can adapt, and it's connected to the time. So that is my answer.
I just had another point to add to the discussion, that I've been part of a research study, although it wasn't probably as, we weren't using quite your criteria, but we were just showing different VR experiences, particularly to not early adopters, like the general public, a range of people. And there was a real difference. Lots of people reported with the narrative VR that they just couldn't spend that long in it. Like, they enjoyed the piece, but they wouldn't want to be in there exactly for more than 20 minutes. But some experiences, like, for example, Tilt Brush, those same people who said, I wouldn't want to be in a headset for more than 20 minutes, would then easily get lost inside Tilt Brush for over half an hour and not notice how long they've been in there, because it's like it activates another part of you that takes you into a flow state. You know, you're in part of the action and you're lost in it. And I haven't seen a narrative VR piece that's taken me into that place. As much as I've enjoyed it and felt moved by it, I've never been taken into a kind of flow state where you lose track of time like that.
Yeah, hello. And I can add a little bit on top of this. The problem actually with the 360 cinematic VR is actually fixed point of view. Why I think is one of the reasons why we can spend much more time in for example, in interactive environment, which also by itself includes 6 degrees of freedom of movement. And in cinematic VR, which is shot from one fixed point, it's completely fixed position. And we as a people, when we look around, we have these micro movements. We don't stay still at all, absolutely. But all 360 shot content is completely still for one point. And after a while, it's problem inside your becomes problem with vestibular apparatus, that you move a bit, but the content, it doesn't move, and you have a problem within that in brains something's wrong with you. Something is wrong with you because you have to have these micro movements in what you see, but there you don't see it, and it's just I think it's currently just technical limitation. When we'll have in cinematic VR 6 degrees of freedom, then
which we will,
which we are well on the way. I think that will be your amount of length of how you can experience this cinematic VR will increase. It's technical. Currently, it's technical problem, and I say in virtual reality as computer generated, there's no such problem. So.
Let me ask you a counter question. I know I was reading some reports. They do right now the technological development for cinematic VR with the ability to move. How far is the technology?
Well, there's 2 ways to do it. One is that you have a point cloud approach, that they make a kind of simple 3D environment from the shot. The footage being shot, the environment is also being scanned, and that footage is being projected as a texture on the simple 3D environment, and then you can have some movement in that. It's not exact, I would say, like real movement but it's simulated. But additionally, you have a light field technology, which would allow more movement within the shot footage and with correct light and correct reflections and everything. So it's more closely. Currently, we have this projection method.
But I was reading that there is reports somewhere where they are developing the camera that would be actually shooting.
Yeah, it's already well on the way. Okay. I think it's like already for a couple of years. There's this company called Lightro, which they were developing one of the first light field photography cameras, where you can change the depth of focus. It's basically the light field system. And now they have developed cameras which were like 360 cameras, which utilize this technology. But the biggest problem with that is you have an incredibly huge amount of data required for this content to work. And you have to have servers to work, because each frame has to be calculated separately for each viewer. No, whenever he looks, each frame has to be calculated. But with this point cloud approach is a little bit simpler. It's basically kind of like mix between game engine and the shot footage. So it's like hybrid. So that is much more closer, and currently I think in Facebook, this last Oculus Connect, they presented this camera which was made together with the Red, and at Facebook that is basically made with this technology. That it's kind of, from multiple cameras it could calculate the space, and then it could project this shot material on top of that, and then you have this resemblance. And that I think will greatly increase how much we can basically how long we can watch cinematic VR. So yeah.
I have no microphone. Thanks. So all in all, okay. This was actually quite a lot of things to follow through, but you brought up an interesting point about you, the audience member. you brought up an interesting point about the how much can a film, how much does the author direct the film watcher? How much does this like? What do you, maybe you could find something in common, like how much does this happen in films for 360 degree video, because the viewer could always miss the entire narrative because he's just doodling around and watching. That's not really the case for film, is it?
Well, there is a very basic discrepancy which is very difficult to overcome, which is like the linear structure of any edited footage and the free will, so to say, of the person immersed into this environment, and they don't really come together very well.
I would agree with Janis. It's actually difficult. I don't think there's a formula. I mean, because the film, I mean, regular, what I call flat 2D, I mean, it comes in the editing room. I mean, you do have a prevision, but ultimately you have, even with the best editing techniques, you know, the fact itself that the audience can, I mean, there are these, I've seen films that do gimmicks, you know, they place the camera somewhere in the corner that you have actually, instead of 360, you have only 180, or blur something out, or make a sounds, or you use a text or layovers, or, you know, somebody like character would speak a phrase that would make you turn in a special direction. But these are not really, I wouldn't call them filmmaking techniques, these are gimmicks. Yeah. And that's so, I don't have really answer. I think it's difficult, and that's one of the disadvantages. And I don't know, I'm not sure whether you can even compare, because there are like things you can do 360, 3D you can do with the regular cinema, and you know, vice versa. And one of them is this ability to control. I haven't seen yet film that that really you know, makes me really controls my point of attention 100%. You know, I still have a choice to look around. I have a choice to rewind. I have a choice to pause, come back, etc. So it's. I would talk more about not terms of the ability to control the audience's attention. I could talk more about a new form of spectatorship. I think like 360, 3D completely requires a new form of spectatorship. I mean, what Janis was saying, I mean, the regular cinema, it's a communal experience. You know, I mean, even if you sit in the dark, you feel people around it. And sometimes if it's a really film that creates empathy, you know, people respond to it. I mean, we can go to neuroscience, you know, with the mirror neurons. I mean, it's, you know, all that theory. We connect with that. Now, the minute you have glasses on, you have a disconnection. I call 360, 3D, I call disjunctive spectatorship, because you are disconnected. It's very, you're personal, intimate, and you choose even the time frame within which you watch your film.
I don't know. I sort of, I always imagine when you talk about virtual reality, I imagine headphones, but for eyes. And I like taking this idea. It might not be necessary. Okay, I guess this might be an open-ended question at this point, but there are, for example, these silent discos where people like gather up, they wear headphones all and listen to music and dance, like in groups of 50. I imagine like there could be, you know, silent, let's watch, yeah, basically to combine to go to a cinema, and then you would sit next to each other and watch the same film, and like be in a make-believe splendid palace or something. But I think this is a very nice time to ask the final question. Where do you think VR is going in your field?
Well, if we take into account my field, which is medicine, rehabilitation, and education, I think in the world there's a huge potential for all of these spheres, because the main thing in medicine, in rehabilitation, in physiotherapy, or in education is to learn something using more specific and very, very the best tools. So when you're going to learn something like language, or if you go into physiotherapy to make some exercises for your back pain, you have to interact, so you have to keep interest, and then you're going to achieve something. Virtual reality is the perfect tool because, or augmented reality, because it doesn't require your concentration, like your conscious concentration. You just put your glasses and do what, and just trying to understand what is around and interact with that. In medicine, it's a perfect tool to learn how to make operations, how to not get burnt out, because a lot of doctors who are working very fastly got burned out because they know how to communicate or receive so much different cases, then just can't get out from it. So a lot of therapies are aimed to change the situation, just to learn how to react. So in rehabilitation, we use virtual reality everywhere. In physiotherapy, when you have to do some exercises. In speech-language therapy, when you have to learn some words. In occupational therapy, when you have to train your fine and gross skills. In medicine, it's everywhere as well. You can learn how to make an operation. You can do an operation using virtual reality. You can, what else you can do? Like, too many things we can do with virtual reality. Perfect. And the education, it's obvious. I mean, much more interesting to learn something when it's near to you than just open the resource in the internet or book and learning from that. So, in my opinion, okay, not on my opinion, on the opinion of the research, literature, scientific papers, this is the huge potential for all of the fields, and it's going to make kind of a revolution in approximately 10 years in Latvia, hopefully. So, great potential.
Well, if you're talking about cinematic VR, I would probably reframe the question saying, you know, is it gonna replace something? No, it's not. It's gonna exist as its own medium, and I think eventually if it's not gonna have ability to interact with the environment, which Armand was talking about, ability to move, I think eventually it will exhaust itself or will stay sort of on experimental work. It definitely will be for some time in the journal, interactive journalism, and also in the news. It will certainly be as a marketing tools for even now it's as a market. There's films like Mr. Robot and IT, and then there's Alien Covenant. There are films that as a supplementary tool to market big Hollywood films. But again, if you really think it's more not revolutionary, I look at the cinematic VR as an evolutionary stage, and I think it's more going towards more. We know we're talking about volumetric cinema. I think it's going towards holographic image eventually. You know, if it's and it's going to be used just like now. You know, films are shot digitally, but here and there still there are films that shot on the film. Sometimes not only for archival, but sometimes in art purposes. So it's going to be around, but it's going to transform, metamorph itself.
Yeah, probably. I would agree with Aigars that most likely it's not going to be a competitor to a film movie-going experience. It's something completely different. But it can, I guess, give the gift of new experiences, something completely different, immerse the person or the watcher in some kind of some very different world, and differently than cinema does it. But on the other hand, it would be very interesting to see if, let's say, some big Hollywood studio decides to approach this, let's call it medium, more seriously, puts lots of money in it, and creates something that we can call a cinematic experience, because it's definitely possible with the right amount of money. It's possible, but what it will be, if it will be just an advanced 3D, let's call it advanced 3D, or a kind of a completely new cinematic experience, it's hard to say. And I'm very skeptical because the gadgets that are required, they're very expensive, and it's just not a financially feasible thing to do, in my opinion, or it's just too risky. I remember, like in the early 90s, there was an attempt to create interactive viewing experience, and it died after like 1 or 2 weeks because it was just not interesting for viewers. And a serious director was involved. I remember Robert Zemeckis made a film, and where the audience was supposed to press a button and choose the next, possible segment or continuation of the story, but it was just not interesting, didn't work. And I don't know what will happen with this virtual reality. I don't know, who knows, but it's interesting.
Okay, but I guess it's quite certain that it's definitely not going to misplace the regular flat two-dimensional screens. Cool. I think there was actually, no, I feel like there were so many topics and there's a lot of common ground, surprisingly a lot of common ground. I was completely sure you would each try to destroy each other. I'm glad you didn't actually, and you found that we found some common ideas. So I think it's yeah, time to call the panel, close the panel. And so I just want to give you a small heads up, some more housekeeping for today, tomorrow. So right now, tonight, we're having the drone category finalists. We're going to watch all the submissions in one go. So if you're interested in these, yeah, well, you should be interested, I mean. Those were hundreds of hours invested by our jury, I suppose. Well, maybe not hundreds, but definitely they were tough. And tomorrow, I hope to see you all tomorrow, those of you offline and those of you online, at around 11. So at 11, we'll begin with the open category finalists. And then we'll go on to talk about, for example, how to decide between practical and CGI effects. The presentation is going to be not exactly a PowerPoint, so it's going to be cooler than that. Talk about using VR, like making money with it. Sound. Not many of you talk about like, you know, when you talk about sound, it's something you notice if it's bad, don't notice if it's good. The perfect filming drone, about a certain journey through Estonia in VR. And of course, controlling drone swarms, I mentioned this in the very beginning. And last but not least, we're going to give out the prizes to the film contestants. One of which is going to probably, well, not probably, definitely, earn €1,000. But yeah, that's just between you and us. So, all right. I'd like to give a round of applause for Aigars, Marina, and Janis. I'd really actually like to give a round of applause for the active audience members. Having the microphone stolen was a wonderful experience. And so let's rip the drone category finalists.
Another day, another life. I'm getting closer to the truth. Life goes too fast to realize. All I want is you. Take me for a walk tonight. Tell me about the things you like. I can tell the story of my life. How I used to run away. I can be your winter, I can give you everything I got. How I used to run away. Let's go outside and do some life. In cities painted with the sun. Life goes too fast to realize. All we have is now. I want to talk about the universe, about the galaxies and stars. We live too fast to realize beauty of the world. Take me for a walk tonight. Tell me about the things you like. I can tell the story of my life. How I used to run away. I can tell you all I say. I can give you everything I got. Take me for a walk tonight. Tell me about the things you like. I can tell the story of my life. How I used to run away. I can tell you all I say. I can give you everything I got. If I could turn the hourglass over, if I could set the clock back, it wouldn't change a thing. I know that. I know that. And when I look at the world around me, I see what might have been, but every deed has got a price tag. Now I know that. In my weakest moment, you call me by name. You call me wide open. You play me like a game.
will you? What kind of music do you call that anyway?
Welke video's wel.
Hey Daisy, yeah, I'm crazy for you. I close my eyes and I pray, but my dreams don't come true. Dear Sandy, you'll never let me get by, no matter how I try. Yeah, I tried and I tried. No matter how I try, yeah, I tried and I tried. Go get permission to forget you. Don't listen to the rhythm of your feet, or to the rhythm of your feet. We found
Che ci racconti, Mauri?
E che vi racconto? Che qui sono sempre a tagliare, taglio.
Non hai da tagliare?
È sempre a tagliare. Però è bello, accontenti la gente.
Latviešu tautas deja ir unikāls kustība un zīmju virknējums, kas vieno latvietu ar savas zemes tūkstošgadīgo pagātni. Spēku zīmes latviešu tautas dejā savieno debesis un zemi, gadskārt norises un laiku. Maģija, ko piešķiram zīmēm, ir varena, un tā palīdz cilvēkam enerģētiski attīrīties un būt saskaņā ar sevi. Atliek vien noticēt. Laimīgs cilvēks ir dabas roti, un jums to nodrošina, kas veicina auglību, kā arī palīdz cilvēkam pilnveidoties. Dievs radīja pasauli, un ja cilvēks palīdz to izveidot labāk, Dievs dod cilvēkam veiksmi, sniedzot spēku grūtā brīdī. Rotējošā Dieva krusta zīme atvēra nelaimes, atraisa radošo enerģiju un sekmē harmoniju. Saules zīme līdzsvaro un nomierina. Tas ir mūžīgās kustības, dzīvības un nemirstības simbols. Glabāsim senlatviešu rakstu zīmi pūrlādi un kā atslēgu tās atvēršanai izmantosim deju, kas izteikti senlatviešu tautas rakstu zīmēs.
So that was the 9th film that we have chosen for the finalists. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you actually learned something from these 9 films and you have a provoked thought. So for now, let's call this day quits and see you in about a little less than 13 and a half hours right here at RISEBA. See ya.